Hello everybody, I'm Christopher Russell, author of the Divinity Twilight series, the first book of which is Divinity Twilight Rebirth. And today I'm going to be sitting down to work on the writer's blocks questions that were sent to me by Joe Compton. When sitting down to visualize the world you are working with, what are the first things you tend to see the most clearly? For me, it's the geography, the political boundaries, and the maps. That's actually where Divinity's Twilight began. It began with much cruder drawings of these two maps, one of southern Lazaria and one of the Kingdom of Dalmatia, where most of Book 1 takes place. And for me, the landscape, the mountains, the topography, where rivers are, where civilizations have grown up, where different people groups have taken root, that's the crux of a story, that where their cultures began, where their nations were founded, is going to influence their worldviews. It's going to influence their technology, their relations with other people. If there is a great giant mineral deposit on the border between two different races, which is something that happens in Divinity's Twilight, that's going to color a lot of their interactions, a lot of their warfare and diplomacy throughout the centuries. And so I tend to start off with a map with the world. For epic fantasy, if there's a smaller world or just a city, you might not need a map. It's really dependent on the type of story you're trying to tell. How do you like to introduce elements of your world? And there's a whole bunch of different options here, including narration, dialogue, action, or even breaking the fourth wall and having the character monologue. And I think that you have to do a combination of all of these, that there are going to be things that you can explain without an info dump, that info dumping is a sin. It can be a major sin or it can be a minor sin, but you typically want to avoid doing that. I know that in early drafts I did a lot of that, and it's something that you work out of as you grow as a writer. And now I prefer to do a lot of it through character interactions, people having a conversation where these elements of their world are going to come up organically. It's a lot easier to do that. You can do it through action. If people are fighting aboard an airship like in Divinity's Twilight, and you get to see their surroundings and they make use of them, that the characters aren't stagnant or static, and they move around the room and see a whole bunch of different things. An airship engine, the cranes and the girders running along the ceiling, or the loom keeping atmosphere around a vessel that's very high in the air. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can weave into your story as you go. When it comes to world building, what element do you feel is most superfluous more times than not? There's no good answer to this because, again, it's dependent on the type of story you're telling. If culture is very important to you, things like eating, the way that people wash clothes, the way that they bake bread, the way that they pour water, the way that they all their customs, the different things, their religions, their cave paintings or their art, their architecture, all those things are important depending on the story you're telling. Going back to food and drink, I do use those in Divinity's Twilight and in other books that I've written, but they often are more of a back burner kind of thing, as is things that you might not see very often in fantasy, like using the restroom or regular problems that human beings have that they have to deal with in the day-to-day. It's not that those things don't exist, that we as readers assume that they do exist, but we often push them aside or ignore them because they're just not as interesting. They're not the crux of the story. However, I would love to describe a lavish feast, all the turnovers and the porridge and the various drinks, the meads, the ales, the gins, everything that goes along with it, the incredible dishes that different people come up with. But as you can see, I'm struggling to describe that here, so I have to do a lot more research to figure out what I want people to eat, what I want these meals to entail. A series that did that very well from my childhood was the Redwall series by Brian Jacques, that the sumptuous, lavish feast that they had just stuck in my mind. You could practically smell the various dishes that they served. But I'd say that sort of takes a back burner in Divinity's Twilight, at least up to this point. Where do you feel more artists go wrong when it comes to world building? Again, I don't think that there's anything that you can necessarily do wrong. You can over-describe, you can info dump, you can spend pages talking about minutia, trivial details, rather than progressing the plot, and that's where your pacing falls apart. That's where most people make their mistake in world building, is that they become so engaged in developing an incredible, wonderful, majestic world that they forget that there's a story that's supposed to be taking place in this world. And so the idea is that you want your characters to experience it, that you want them to be telling the reader about the world as they go, that you don't want to be going back and rehashing things that the character should already know, that they shouldn't have to explain to themselves or to other people. It has to, again, the word that constantly comes up is organic, that if you would not talk about something in our world, in our reality, with a friend, then you shouldn't be doing it in a story. And I make this mistake, other people make this mistake. It's something that inevitably comes up because we're not going to tell a person what a fork looks like, what a spoon looks like. Those are all things that we assume. Yet, whether through your character's thoughts or through their conversations, you may have to get across elements like that in your world building. In thinking about your world expanding is your approach to add in things you have already created outside of the story you were telling, or creating something from scratch, brand new, to add into and build upon the world that exists. Again, this is something that you can do a little bit of both. I tend to have most of my ideas away from a story. And so what I do is I add those into my phone or into my handy-dandy notebook that is starting to fall apart, and I save them for later. And then when I'm working on a chapter, or a part or a work in progress, an entire novel, I'll go and grab all the ideas that I think are pertinent to the story I want to tell. A story often starts with a central idea. For Divinity Twilight, it was the maps. I decided that I wanted to have 7 races that were going to be distributed among this map and along the rivers, the mountains, the forests, the geographic features, the wastelands, the barrens, etc. And for an Asian fantasy standalone that I'm working right now, the very first line began with, well, why haven't the horns blown? That there is some sort of hunting party that has gone out to obtain meat for this village or settlement, and there's some reason that they haven't come back, and that was the inciting incident, the initiating conflict. And I think that that's where a lot of people start with world building, and then whether they create it on the spot or whether they go back to their notes and the various documents that they've created where they've had random ideas, and they pull from them, and they start to weave from that point on. And I've often heard, this is Brandon Sanderson and a few other people, they describe world building as an iceberg, that you have this tip that is sticking up above the water. Hopefully this isn't the iceberg that sank the Titanic or sank anyone's books. But you only see a little bit of the iceberg above the water. And most of the iceberg is down here, the greater percentage. And if you were to describe this tip, which the reader is seeing, and then you were to also create all of this beneath it, like, say, Tolkien did with his Elvish languages and all of his mythology stretching back thousands and thousands of years, well, it takes a lot of time. You can spend years and years and years doing that. However, if you want to tell more stories, you can't have all of this iceberg beneath the water. That you have to show the reader this, and then you have to make them think that the rest of it is there, but it's actually hollow. And that iceberg would actually flip over, but just to go with the analogy, it has to be a hollow iceberg. That you might have had ideas or you might have created some of that, but it's hidden. It's not there. And that's what you trick the readers into thinking, that your world has to breathe. They have to be there. They have to experience it and apply their senses to it along with the characters. And that's the crux of world building. Convince the reader that this could be real, that they could go there, vacation there, and experience the same things as the characters. And that's what I feel perfect world building is. I'm not there. Most people I read aren't there, because we're all striving to get better. We're all striving to become better writers. My website is ChristopherRussellAuthor.com. I'm the author of the Divinity Twilight series. It's epic fantasy combined with sci-fi, a lot of steampunk and military fantasy elements. And the basic premise is, what if the heroes of legend didn't save the world, but only delayed the inevitable? and we explore that from there. My social media links are Christopher_Russell_author. That's Instagram. My Twitter is Chris DT author. And then my Facebook is Divinity's Twilight Fantasy Novels. Again, thank you for exploring world building with me, and I hope you have a great day.